You should go for it. The change you want to make, the risk you've been considering, the new thing you might start. You should go for it. More than likely, you will have to leave something behind. There will be unexpected twists and turns. Fear will sneak up and make a home in your heart. There will be a million reasons for you to stay put right where you are. But you were made for this. To grow, to move, to change. It won't be easy, but it will definitely be worth it. Stop worrying about what could go wrong. Start wondering about what God will do if you would just let go.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to church. I'm Matt Miofsky. I'm the lead pastor here. So if you're new, especially want to thank you. We really appreciate you checking out the gathering. And we've been talking about change and how do we navigate through change and transition. That's what this series has been all about. And I've been using the Exodus story, the Old Testament story, which I said it's a journey story. But it's not just a geographical journey. I think it really represents all of our spiritual journeys. But it's a journey that is in three phases. And I just want to remind you of the phases. I'll put them up here. It's leaving Egypt. We talked about that in week 1, what it's like to leave behind something old in order to even set out towards something new. Last week I talked about navigating the wilderness. We laughed a lot. We talked about the roundabout way. Remember that? You know, twirling around in the desert for a while before you figure out exactly where it is that you're trying to go. That's that in-between space. You've left one thing behind. Now you're moving on to something else. Well, here's the problem with serving a really smart congregation like you all. Somebody emailed me this past week and they said, "Man, I love this series, love the idea. I have one problem." I said, "Well, what's the problem?" He typed back and he said, I know the story. And see, the Israelites, they had the courage. They left Egypt, went through the Red Sea. They went through the wilderness, which they had to be in for like 40 years. You didn't tell us that last week, 40 years. So I'm going to get to that. But here's the problem I have. They never made it to the promised land. Most of them, anyway, died in the wilderness. So if we're supposed to be following the Israelites, are we going to die in the wilderness? So today we have to address that as a congregation. I was not trying to pull one over on you. But today we need to begin talking about the third stage, which is entering the promised land. I say begin because this is a story I'm going to tell in 2 parts. We're not going to get to the promised land until next week. Next week, we're going to end this series. So I'm just giving you kind of fair warning that today we're going to almost get there, but not quite. Because see, something happened. Like remember, the Israelites all along this journey, their main nemesis in this journey has been what? It's been fear. And I think that's our main nemesis when it comes to change. It's fear. And so I said, when they were leaving Egypt, it was a fear of leaving behind what was comfortable and what was familiar. But they overcame it and they moved on. In the wilderness, the fear was a little bit different. It was the fear of uncertainty, of not knowing how long it's going to take or where you're going or when you're going to finally get to some new reality. They wanted to go back to Egypt, but they pushed through and they did that. But then something happened. They got so close, but when they got to the promised land, they actually, fear once again cropped up like we would expect it to, except this time they gave into it. And I think it's really important for us to dwell on this part of the story for a week, even though it's not the loveliest part of the story, because we're going to find that in our own journey towards change, not only is fear constantly going to crop up, but our choices really do matter. Our choices, God does give us choice, and our choices about what to do when we're faced with fear make a difference on where we end up. It makes a difference on our destination. So what in the world happened to the Israelites? How did they get almost there and then give in to that fear? What in the world happened? Well, I'm going to pick up where we left off last week. So if you weren't here last week, we talked about the Israelites leaving Egypt. They made it into the wilderness. I joked around. Remember, I made you use your left palm and draw circles on your palm. It says that God took them the roundabout way, not a direct route. And I said that's like a metaphor for what God does with us. Like we want everything in life to just be direct, but sometimes God has a different plan, and we take a windy roundabout route to get there. But this week, I want to actually show you the real map because I'm going to tell you what their journey ended up looking like. So throw up our actual map. And remember, they started out over there in Egypt. They got out here into the wilderness. Now, you can't see it, but see where the line kind of plunges all the way down south. And it goes off the screen there. Down there at the very bottom of that peninsula was Mount Sinai. Now, so what God did is he led the Israelites out of Egypt. Remember, they were trying to go to the promised land, but God took them straight down the other direction. That's a whole different sermon for a different day, but sometimes God does that to you. God actually takes you down before God takes you up. It seems like you're moving further away from where you thought you were going, but in reality, God has something planned for you. So God led the people down. All the way down at the bottom was Mount Sinai. That was a place of transformation. God gave them the law. God taught them the things that God wanted to teach them in the wilderness. And then you see that dotted line starts coming back up. And so God started leading them back up toward the land that God had promised them. And so when they get right there to that little bump right over here, that's when God said, you're here. The promised land is right over those hills. It's right over there. I've done my work. By the way, this part of the journey probably took a little less than a year, maybe 10, 11 months to go from Egypt all the way down, all the way back up. And God said, I think my work here is done. It's been 11 months. I've shaped you in the wilderness. There's the promised land, the land full of milk and honey, the land I promised you. Go get it. And so you would think that we get to this part of the story, and the Israelites looking out over the mountain into the promised land would sigh a collective sigh of relief. We're here. You would think there'd be massive excitement. We've made it through the wilderness. We don't have to wonder anymore how long it's going to take. There's the thing that God had been promising us. You would think that they would just rush in, but that's not what happened. Instead, we begin to see that they were scared of something. They were starting to get cold feet. And so that's where I want to pick up. I want to pick up on what happened when God led them, 11 months probably since they had left Egypt, and said, there's the promised land, go and take it. And so the story I want to read to you, it's kind of funny because what the Israelites decide to do is, there's the promised land, and they say to each other, like, yeah, we don't really know what's over there, though. And I know, God, you've been really faithful. You've led us out of Egypt, split the sea, produced manna in front of us. But we're not sure. Have you ever heard the phrase, trust but verify? Any of you ever heard that? Yeah? No? You should try it sometimes. Trust but verify. That was the Israelites. We trust you, God, but we want to verify. So what they decide to do is they get spies, 12 spies, it says. And they say, why don't you go into the land first? That way, if you get killed, we'll know that there's something dangerous over there. And then you come back and tell us what it's like. And then once we know what it's like, then we'll go over there. Okay, so that's what happened. So Moses collects 12 spies from the 12 tribes, and Moses sends them over into the promised land. And the story says that they were there for 40 days, 40 nights. That's symbolic. And then they come back. And when they come back, they give a report about what they saw. So I'm going to read to you the report because this gets at the heart of what happened to the Israelites. Okay, this comes from Numbers chapter 13, verse 25. This is what it says. It says, they returned from exploring the land after 40 days. That's the spies. They went directly to Moses, Aaron, the entire Israelite community in the Paran desert at Kadesh. That was that little bump on our map. They brought back a report to them and the entire community and showed them the land's fruit. They had it. They gave their own report. Here's the report. Ready? They said, we entered the land to which you sent us. It's actually full of milk and honey. And this is its fruit. There are, however, powerful people who live in the land. The cities have huge fortifications or huge walls, and we even saw the descendants of the Anakites there. The Anakites, by the way, were like a big people. Think Goliath in the Old Testament. So the warriors were big. Okay, so this is what the spies' report actually says. It says, first, on the one hand, the thing that God promised us, it's everything God said it would be. God has been totally faithful. It really has milk. It really has honey. Look at the fruit. They brought it back. This land really is a good land. But some of them say, but there are challenges there, right? By the way, I think this is really important for me to stress for just a second. When God takes us somewhere new, God really does have promises for us in the future, but God never promises us that it's going to be easy. And God never promised the Israelites that the change that God was leading them toward was going to be without challenge. And so the spies say there are going to be some challenges. That, for example, there are powerful people in the land that we're going to have to overcome. There are huge fortifications, high walls that we're going to have to scale. There are really powerful warriors that we're going to have to vanquish. There are some challenges if we want this change to be ours. But that was the report. It's everything that God had promised, and there are going to be some challenges. I just want to stop for a second. I'll say to you, the thing that God is leading you toward in your life, the change, the new reality, don't ever misunderstand. It is going to be new. It is going to be good, but it's going to have its challenges. There's no doubt. So now you begin to see, though, that they have this decision to make. What are they going to do? And so now the spies move to advocating for what they think the Israelites ought to do. Let me read to you what the spies go on to say. This is verse 30. It says, "Now Caleb, he was one of the spies, calmed the people before Moses and said, 'We must go up and take possession of it because we are more than able to do it.'" So here Caleb is saying, I know there's challenges, but this is it. This is what God has led us towards. We can do this. But verse 31, "But the men who went up with him, the other spies, said, 'We can't go up against the people. They're stronger than we are.' They started a rumor about the land that they had explored, telling the Israelites, 'The land that we crossed over to explore is a land that devours its residents. All the people we saw in it are huge men. We saw there the Nephilim. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and that's how we must have appeared to them.'" I'll explain that in just a second. So do you see what's going on here? Now there are two voices coming from the spies. On the one side, there's Caleb and also Joshua. He's not mentioned here, but Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb say, "Look, we know that there are challenges." But they say, "Let's not forget, we are more than able to do this. Not because we're strong, but look, we've got God. God led us away from Pharaoh, the most powerful king in the world. God led us through the Red Sea. God led us through the wilderness. This is not a challenge that we can't overcome. We can do this, people. We just have to go." But then you have the other 10, they represent a different voice. And if you notice in the passage, all of a sudden, what do the other 10 say? Well, they don't say anything about God. They don't say anything about what they're able to do. All they're able to see when they look out into the promised land are the challenges. And now the challenges aren't just challenges. They are like problems that we could never overcome. This is really important. Pay attention to this because we do this all the time in our life. What we look at as a challenge, suddenly if we let that voice get too strong in our head, challenges become, obstacles that we could never overcome. What do they say? Suddenly now they say the land that we crossed over to explore is the land that devours its residents. Now they eat people over there. All the people we saw in it are huge men. Do you ever do that? Everything is huge. Now, not just a few, but now everybody is huge. And then we saw there the Nephilim. Now, not only were there warriors, do you know what the Nephilim in the Old Testament, these were mythological giants. That's what they say. So in a different translation, it says we saw giants. We were like grasshoppers in front of them. In other words, there is no way that we could do this. And so the Israelites were faced with two different voices speaking into their ears. On the one side was the voice of Caleb and Joshua. It was the voice saying, "You can do this. We can go there. Don't forget God. God's with you. We got this." On the other side were the 10 spies saying, "You don't have this. The challenges are too great. The walls are too high. The warriors are too big. You're going to get devoured if you try this." On the one hand, they could choose trust. And on the other hand, they could choose fear. Friends, I'm stressing this because here the Israelites were standing on the brink of the promised land. They'd finally reached that stage of their journey. All they had to do was enter the land. All they had to do was choose to continue to trust God. I'm stressing it because I think that in our own journeys, we will reach points all along the way where we have the exact same choice to make. Are we going to pay attention only to the challenges? Or are we going to be willing to trust God? I've said all along in this series that I take the Exodus story to be a metaphor in part of all of our spiritual journeys that God is taking us on. That God takes all of us from one place to new places. And so each stage, I've said, corresponds to a stage of change in our life. And this one is no different. For me, this stage represents a new reality. At every point in your life, God is going to move you from one place into the wilderness and eventually present you with a new reality. So stage 3 is a new reality. Here's the challenge. Every time you are on the brink of actually being able to change something in your life, I promise you one of the challenges is readiness. You will not think that you're ready yet. You will all of a sudden begin to doubt yourself. The fear that I think creeps up here is a fear of failing. What if I try this and it doesn't work? What if I go for this and I don't make it? What if the challenges are too great for me? And the temptation, if we let fear find too much of a home in our heart, our temptation is actually to stall. To say, yeah, I want to do that, but not yet. I want to do that, but I'm not smart enough yet. I'm not prepared enough yet. I'm not strong enough yet. I haven't studied it enough. I haven't prayed over it enough. I haven't made enough pros and cons lists. This is what stalling looks like. It sounds really crazy to say this, but I think the scariest part of change is actually when the change is right in front of us, when the opportunity is actually right there. When we actually arrive at a chance to do something new with our life. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but have you ever prayed or hoped for something? And I found that in my head, it's actually easy to brainstorm things, to pray about things, to hope for things, to wish things would change, to complain about things that are. And then all of a sudden your life starts shifting and starts moving. And it can be in anything. I mean, think about any preferred new reality that you dream about. Maybe it's a new relationship or a new job opportunity or a move to a new city or some change in your personal life, whatever it is. But I always think that change looks better at a distance. Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Like change looks really good when you're dreaming, talking, hanging out with friends and just kind of joking around about it. But then all of a sudden, if you start moving closer and closer and closer to that change, whether it's taking a new job or new relationship or moving to a new place or whatever it is, the closer you get to change, the scarier it begins to look. Has that ever happened to you? That it's one thing to talk about change. It's another thing to actually begin to do it. It's one thing to dream and pray for change. It's another thing if God says, fine, let's go. I'm going to take you from one place and I'm going to take you to another place. Change looks different the closer we get to it. From a safe distance, everybody wants to change. But you've known people that when they actually have the opportunity, they all of a sudden shy away. Let me share with you what this looked like in my own life. It's no secret that the biggest professional transition in my life was when I left a job, like a stable one, to start a new church, this church. 13 years ago, I started the Gathering. And when I started the Gathering, that was the biggest transition in that point in my professional life. It still stands as the biggest transition. And I was scared all on the way, so I don't want to make it sound like I wasn't. I mean, just to voice it out loud, to begin to think about it, dream about it. I was 28 years old, didn't feel particularly prepared for it. But, so as we moved forward with it, as the bishop began to consider it, as people in my life began to support it, we moved. But I will tell you, in that whole season, people will often ask me, like, what was the hardest moment? And I'll tell you, the hardest day of my life was July 1st, 2006. And you might wonder, like, what in the world was July 1st, 2006? Well, July 1st, 2006 was the first day that I no longer had a paycheck from my old church. I was no longer preparing to start a new church. I was no longer dreaming about it or writing up plans or doing any of that. July 1st, 2006 was the first day of actually having to do it. That was the first day. And I remember that day distinctly because, up till that point, it had been preparing and planning and praying and discerning and wondering and coming up with contingency plans. But now all of a sudden, I'd stepped over the line and now I just had to do it. Now I had to live it. Now there was nowhere to hide. There was no more planning to do. Now it was sink or swim. It was either going to succeed or it was going to fail. And the truth is about that day that I try to remember what I was scared of, but the truth is when that day finally came that I'd been praying and hoping for, I was scared to death. And there were a lot of things I was scared of. I mean, I was scared that I didn't know what I was doing, that I wasn't smart enough or prepared enough in order to do this. I was scared that maybe I hadn't prepared and planned enough to minimize all the risk. I didn't feel capable. I didn't feel adequate. But probably the biggest fear of mine was that I was going to fail. And I didn't want to fail, especially in front of so many people. I spent the better part of 18 months so scared of failing that I don't think I really focused on all the promises that God had in this new stage of my life. For 18 months, I had two voices in my head, a voice of fear and a voice of trust. And I confess that all too many times in those first 18 months, I let the voice of fear get the best of me. I'm sharing this with you, guys, because whatever it is you choose to do in your life, those two voices are going to come at some point. Those two voices are going to come up in your own life as well. You're going to be looking at something new in your life, and I promise you, you can either focus on the promise of it, the good things about it, and the God who brought you there, or you can focus on all the challenges and all the obstacles and let that voice of fear find too powerful of a home in your heart. And I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't plan and you shouldn't prepare and you don't need to think wisely about changes that you want to step into. You ought to do all those things. But what I am suggesting is there is a fine line between preparing and planning and writing out lists and going through all the contingencies and praying about it and discerning it. There's a fine line between that and then suddenly just being scared to go for it. I've seen a lot of people under the guise of wise planning just being scared to ever finally step into a new reality in their life. And there comes a point in all of our journeys where no matter how much more you pray about it, no matter how much more time you give yourself to prepare, no matter how much planning you do or lists you draw up, there comes a point in everyone's journey where you just have to take the risk, where you can no longer minimize that anymore. You can't plan for every contingency. I call it this: at some point we all reach the Nike stage of change. You have to just do it, right? I'm going to tell you what happened to the Israelites that day. And I actually say this with sadness. It actually haunts me when I read this part of the story. Standing there, they have Joshua and Caleb on the one hand. We should trust the God who brought us this far. On the other hand, you have the 10 spies. Look at all the challenges. Look at how hard it's going to be. And standing there on the brink of the promised land that day, the Israelites chose the voice of fear. They chose to see all the ways that they might fall short, all the ways that they weren't ready, all the ways that they felt inadequate. And they did not remember that they had a God that was with them. And so do you know what they did? They basically said, hey, let's take one more lap in the desert. This desert isn't so bad, right? Let's take one more lap. And after a lap, next season, after the kids are out of school or in school or graduated or whatever, we'll be better prepared. When we come back around, we'll enter the promised land, no problem. So they took another lap in the desert. And then they took another lap, and then they took another lap, and then they took another lap, and they did that for 40 years. See, their punishment for listening to the voice of fear was that they would never get to see the thing that God had promised. Their fear became for them really a prison and a punishment. The time never came when they could see beyond the challenges, and so they spent their entire life circling around the change they wanted to make, but never being able to do it. And the reason that haunts me, and the reason I want it today to haunt you, is because that can happen to us in our life, where we can decide, next year, in a few months, when the kids are this, when my relationships are here, when my job is in a little bit better position, I'll make that change that I want to make. And we can circle around for months, for years, and sometimes we can die circling around changes that we wanted to make in our life, but never having the courage to actually do it. I like to say this: God is not a cruel God. God did not take the Israelites out in the desert to stay there for 40 years. The first year was on God. The other 39 years, that was on them. But here's the cool thing about the story. God did not take the Israelites out in the desert for their story to end there. Next week, we're going to see what happened to Caleb and Joshua. The two that chose to trust. Because they don't die in the wilderness. but instead they get to see the thing that God had promised them. But for today, I just want you all to remember that the road to change in your life will include a choice at some point between fear and trust. Friends, today I want you to choose trust. Let's pray. God, you know those of us that need to hear this message today. You know those of us who came here today, and you're speaking to us because we have those two voices in our life. A voice that is primarily about fear, that wants to point out all the challenges, all the things that could be hard, all the risks that we might undertake. But God, today I want your Holy Spirit to fill our hearts and fill our minds, that we might remember that you are a God of power and might, that you are a God who has brought us through miracles in the past and helped us overcome challenges and brought us through valleys, that you are a God who has not failed us yet. And you will be with us as we step forward. And so, God, as we sit here today, my prayer is that when those voices creep up in our hearts and in our minds, a voice to trust or a voice to fear, that you would help us to choose trust. We pray these things in the name of the one who walks beside us, Jesus Christ, our Savior. And together God's people said, amen.